Welcome to the 10th anniversary UK PONI annual conference. I'm delighted to have you with us. My name is Tom Plant. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the Director of Proliferation and Nuclear Policy at the Royal United Services Institute. I'm also the Director of the UK Project on Nuclear Issues. Always delighted to have this event at RUSI, and slightly sad obviously that we can't all meet up in person, but I am really excited about the program that we have today and in all the coming events that we have lined up. I'm aware that for some of you this is going to be your first introduction to the UK Project on Nuclear Issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later on in this address. I'm also going to talk a bit about the conference and why we set things up the way we have. We have 120 or so people in the room right now. We have about 300 registered over the whole conference, which is absolutely fantastic. Good representation for the rest of Europe, some North America, and some from Asia even. So if you're dialing in from Asia, if you're connecting in from Asia, I have no idea what time it is there, but I salute your bravery and commitment. I hope we can live up to that. So let me talk about this conference a little bit. The UK PONI Annual Conference is really about where we showcase some of the best emerging talent that we have in the UK's community. And now, of course, we look more internationally these days. So we have a number of international presenters as well. We'll be analysing some of the key issues that are facing the nuclear community. And we'll be listening to what our emerging scholars have to say, as well as some really expert speakers, more established speakers. There is another function that UK PONI tries to serve as well, as showcasing, developing. We also try and connect the community up with each other, because I know that there's lots and lots of, one of the real strengths of UK PONI is the breadth of people that it draws in. We have people from industry, we have people from anti-nuclear advocacy, we have people from the military and so on, lots and lots of different viewpoints. And that's been one of the real strengths, is we bring all these disparate views together and have sort of constructive, friendly dialogues. We build relationships across divides. And it's one of the things that I have personally valued in all of my long association with the UK Project on Nuclear Issues. So we haven't forgotten that connecting function. And while we'll be trying to do some of that online, we're also remembering that we want to be able to celebrate the 10th anniversary of UK PONI in person at some point. So we do have some plans for doing that, which will be, pandemic dependent. And hopefully we'll be able to get advantage of some of the things that we wanted to do that we could have only really done in person. For example, you'll see on your conference program, hopefully you've all found that. If you haven't found it, please go to the conference website and you'll see it there. On the front page, it features some artwork from Dr. Michael Mulvihill from Newcastle University, who was the co-investigator on an AHRC-funded project called Turning Fylingdales Inside Out. And we were going to have a bit of an art exhibition, believe it or not. So we really wanted to do some creative stuff that only works in person. And we're going to hold those plans and we're going to put them into action as soon as pandemic circumstances permit. But for this conference, we have a really great range of speakers, which we'll discuss later. A broad range of ages, broad range of backgrounds, established and emerging. And this is, I think, probably our most ambitious annual conference yet. It's certainly the first one that we've done completely online. I think it's the biggest one that RUSI has done completely online so far. And it's certainly the widest spread, as you've seen from that poll. And this is really one of my favorites, highlights of the year. It's obviously sad not to be seeing people in person, but it is really great to have been able to work with some really talented emerging nuclear scholars to hear what they have to say on some of the key issues that we wanted to address. So as you see, we picked up this conference. We really wanted to look forward as we look back. We wanted to celebrate 10 years of UK PONI, but we also wanted to look ahead to the next 10 or 20. So when we had our call for proposals, we were really focusing on futures in some key areas. But I briefly want to look at where we started so we can sort of look back and remember, where we've come and think about where we might want to go in future. So in our program, you'll see there's some notes from former directors of UK Project on Nuclear Issues. My boss, Malcolm Chalmers, Andrea Berger, my predecessor, and first UK PONI director, Commodore David Jarvis, who really takes a lot of the credit for kicking all of this off. We're obviously going to hear from some alumni later on, although I would say that you never really leave the UK PONI community. You're always part of the family. So when David Jarvis set this up, he was actually my second boss in the Ministry of Defense, as it happens, when I started my career. He was following the excellent example of the US program, CSIS PONI, which is initiated by John Hamray and Clark Murdoch, and now ably led by Rebecca Hersman. And he quite rightly notes the support from industry that's allowed UK PONI to flourish over the last 10 years. I think it's only right that I give some name checking here as well. I want to give thanks to our conference sponsors, AWE and Lockheed Martin, who've supported UK PONI since the beginning, and our other supporters at the moment, who are MASS, Babcock, Jacobs, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, the Ministry of Defence, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Thanks to all of you who have supported us over that long period and helped us grow into what we are now. Now, if you remember that, I mean, the early days of this initiative were really about just simply running a single annual conference, one event, working towards a bilateral exchange with the US. Now we have a substantial program, which many of you will have been part of, but some of you might not know that. So I just want to lay out some of the things here for you. So if you like the experience that you've had today, you can think about the other things, other ways you might want to get involved with UK PONI. So we run a set of professional development workshops on nuclear weapons policy, nuclear weapons technology, and on writing for a policy audience. We deliver experiential learning through simulations, war games, that kind of thing. In fact, one of those we ran a couple of months ago. It's one of RUSI's first activities, and again, another ambitious one, multilateral negotiating game through Zoom, believe it or not. We still have that UK-US bilateral exchange that in the early days we were working towards, and obviously we have a very close relationship with that, with the US program. Other events like site tours, roundtables, book launches, and so on. And last but not least, the UK Project on Nuclear Issues blog, which isn't necessarily something that we write, but it's something we manage and try and, it's designed to be an accessible first publishing platform for aspiring nuclear commentators, wherever you might sit. So I'd encourage you to check that out and consider writing for it. It is really supposed to be a very engaging and open approach to your first publications. Now, where we come from UK PONI, given the impact of the pandemic, unfortunately, this is very unlikely to be a growth year for the program, as I'm sure you can understand. But we really do want to protect what we have developed over that period. And we're really committed to finding new ways to get these events and content to you, even if we can't meet in person, and helping you connect online. So we're still working through our ideas on that. Obviously, we're working very hard on it. Ideas, as ever, are always welcome. We know we don't have a monopoly on good ones. So please do fire those into the UK PONI team if you have some good thoughts. So I do want to just think about looking forward. Why is UK PONI relevant? Well, just as David Jarvis and the early noughties identified this crisis in human capability to deal with future nuclear challenges, I fully expect that the next 3 days will lay out a whole range of reasons why we need to develop a broader cadre of people who can think critically and innovatively on nuclear issues. And I might add, are also in the habit of cooperating with people, even if they don't agree with them. Really one of those strengths of PONI. I mean, even without, this conference is not considering really regional proliferation challenges like North Korea, Iran, the wider Middle East, the perpetually worrying India, Pakistan, dyad, which might become a triad with China. Even without those, we have a very full 3 days to dive into, which I think gives a sense of the range of issues to deal with. So our hope over these 3 days, and then subsequently with our program as you engage with it, is to be able to equip you and those who come after you with the tools and connections to be able to deal with those challenges as they evolve in coming decades. So the first area of the conference, which we're going to deal with today, emerging technology and proliferation. And that's not just proliferation about the spread of nuclear weapons, but also about the developments in nuclear weapons technology and related systems within powers that already have them. And really, I suspect my own experience of this is a very fundamentally very complicated space, as I think our panelists will lay out. There are more relevant actors than there used to be. Cold War models, which are principally bilateral for deterrence, are simply less relevant than they were. And multilateral models are exceptionally complex and hard to model. In all of that mix, rapidly advancing technologies are really disrupting, making it very hard to predict futures. And there's this huge crossover between nuclear and non-nuclear technologies. I mean, in 2018, the US Nuclear Posture Review indicated some of these things. There was, quite a lot of conversation around it at the time. And, in recent weeks, Russia has put out its own version. Really, it's not quite a nuclear posture review, but very similar, State Principles of Nuclear Doctrine, which basically says, well, in some circumstances, non-nuclear weapons could engage nuclear decision-making. So there is really an explicit acknowledgement of that now. And so in a world where there's less recognition of global commons, in space, for example, or in the internet, competition might be a more relevant paradigm than cooperation. There's going to be some significant impacts on the way we think about stability. And it's kind of inevitable, I suspect, that some who start out being pro-nuclear, pro-deterrence, will find ways that supports their position. Some who start out as anti-nuclear at all costs will find ways that supports their position. I tend to think that we should follow our noses. We should be critically analysing the situation as we find it and adjust our positions accordingly. So that's certainly something we try to do at RUSI, and I hope we can encourage you to do the same. So we have two panels today to discuss those issues, and a great keynote, Dr. Pippa Malmgren, a RUSI Senior Associate Fellow, technologist, economist, and futurist, who I'll introduce later on, but really excited to have her with us. Tomorrow, we're actually going to be hearing, I think, a lot from an area where I suspect you're going to have more to tell us than we would have to tell you, which is about challenges for developing and sustaining expertise in the next generation. It's clearly an area where UK, PONI, and others need to focus. But there are serious issues, I think, as we will hear tomorrow, with how the community is set up to do this. Are we losing too many talented people because of structural issues with our field? Are there realistic career paths available for them to aspire to? And diversity in the nuclear field is clearly something which we know that the next generation cohort, as we are in particular, is really concerned about. As a recipient of quite substantial privilege myself, I have a lot of learning to do, which I'm walking through, but I hope we're taking steps in the right direction, and suggestions from the UK PONI community there are very welcome. I do want to make some brief points, which are also in the conference program, but I want to flag up here what UK PONI and RUSI more broadly is doing on these issues. On gender in particular, we've put a lot of focus on that. And in recent months, our Director General, Karen von Hippel, joined up to the Gender Champions in Nuclear Policy initiative, making pledges to take steps to actively minimize gender bias in recruitment practices, to look at our research methods to make sure that they ensure diversity and inclusion in publications and outputs. And we committed to set up an initiative to rebalance expertise in defense and security, promoting the work of those who identify as women initially, and then expanding to other areas which might be underrepresented. Insofar as this conference is concerned, this is the first year that we really trialed this, and I think it's worked exceptionally well considering the speakers that have resulted. We had a blind selection based on our UK PONI Board of Advisors. Didn't see who had submitted the abstracts. We didn't know anything about the background of the presenters when we were discussing them. And this was really our way of trying to reduce our own biases, and I think it's resulted in a really fantastic array. So we'll be continuing that in future. We do also want to move beyond gender, though, because events of recent weeks have really thrust into greater prominence discrimination faced by Black people and other people of colour, which is perhaps something where we have focused less on, and perhaps we should do more. It's on all of our minds here at RUSI and in the UK PONI team. We're thinking as an institute about what we can do better. We don't have any firm answers, but we are still developing on this. And again, suggestions welcome. We're very clear on age issues, for example. UK PONI, we're not next generation. We're emerging, because we recognise that some people might come to the field late, and indeed I think we hear from at least one person who fits that category over the coming days. So this is, as I say, an area where you all have a lot to offer and know as much as we do, at least. So tomorrow's session should be very informative. I'm really excited to have a keynote for that day. Izumi Nakamitsu, UN Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, a previous speaker at RUSI, is going to come back and talk about her views on this issue, and also the Secretary General's disarmament agenda, which obviously deals with new tech. Finally, on our last day, we have a day that deals with really some of the crunchy issues of nuclear policy and strategy, dealing with the decisions that the UK and its allies will have to make in coming years. So our panel of emerging scholars are going to look at the role of nuclear weapons and nuclear power in national strategy, with an interactive policy exercise later in the day that deals with calculations that non-nuclear weapon states might have to make regarding the ban treaty, which will likely enter into force this year. The coming decade is really one of transition in the UK nuclear weapons programme, with significant developments on submarine and warhead expected. But we are just about, what with COVID, likely to enter into a global economic crisis, at least comparable to that of 2007 through 9. So tough choices await. And it will be very interesting to round off the day with Angus Lapsley, Director General Strategy International in MOD, who is really responsible for putting all those pieces together and working out how it should fit. So I'm very excited to have him along again. So that's probably enough from me. I do want to wrap up, though, with just giving a few pointers on how we want to run this conference. So other speakers, some are more experienced than others. For some, this is their first speaking engagement. That's always been the tradition of UK PONI. We try and foster a friendly atmosphere, which is a little bit harder online, obviously, but we will try and keep that going. Each of our speakers is going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes. You'll be able to submit questions anytime via the Q&A box, which we'll moderate. And then if you like a question that you see from someone else, you can upvote it, a bit like Reddit for those of you who look at that. If you ask a question, please identify yourself by name and affiliation in the text box. We're on record, but we're not going to sort of treat questions as institutional. It won't be, say, the MOD asking something. If someone from the MOD asks it, it will be that person. So please don't let that hold you back. Chairs will ask questions on your behalf, so you won't need your video on. And with that, I think that is probably all you need to hear from me. Over to our first panel, which will be chaired by Alexandra Stickings, who's a research fellow for space policy and security in the military sciences team at RUSI. She looks at the military use of space, space warfare, counter-space capabilities, amongst other things. Delighted she can be with us for this panel, which promises to be really exciting. So with that, welcome to the 10th anniversary UK PONI annual conference. And Ali, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, welcome everyone to panel 1, AI, cyber and space. I think Tom gave a really good introduction as to why we need to be looking at these issues. And certainly for me, it's very difficult to escape news of new technologies. Every forum that I'm involved in, every event I go to always has some sort of discussion on emerging technologies, cyber, AI, space. I mean, I work on space. It's very difficult, I think, even the news to escape questions about the Space Force and what that means, and all these new concepts and questions about conflict in warfare and what this new technology means. So we do need to understand this new tech, the capabilities that they bring with them, not just in terms of their immediate effects, but also their impact on the broader concept of strategic stability and what these mean in that sort of much bigger picture, rather than the narrow focus I think that we sometimes have when we get a little bit too much into the detail. And to help us explore those issues today, we have 4 presentations. We're going to start with Jonathan Roberts from Lockheed Martin, who's going to be looking at the role of AI in nuclear weapon systems. Be followed by Dr. Charlotte Levy from Babcock, and she's going to be looking at the global AI race and strategic balance. We're then moving on to space and cyber with Marina Favaro, who's going to be looking at these capabilities. And then finally, Jaewoo Shin, who's going to be looking at the implications of real-time open source intelligence. So I think we're definitely going to be covering all of those new technologies that are so important to this discussion. And on that, I'd like to ask Jonathan to start his presentation.
Welcome to our presentation entitled Human versus Machine, the Role of AI in Nuclear Weapons Systems. And before I begin, I would like to thank the co-writers, Adam, Paul, Jenny, and Rebecca for their support. This presentation aims to be a technical exploration into the risks and opportunities artificial intelligence can bring to nuclear weapon systems and the impact this might have on the level of human involvement. It's also important to be obvious that the views and opinions expressed here are those of the authors and don't represent the views of Lockheed Martin. The definition of AI is a somewhat grey area. For this work, it is defined as a computer system that mimics human cognitive functions, such as learning and problem solving. And based on this, for example, the computation in the Cold War era nuclear weapon systems are classed as precursors to AI. The nuclear weapon system is considered in a broad sense, not just the nuclear warheads and delivery systems, but also all the nuclear force related systems, such as platform, command and control, and early warning. And later on, we will have a look at the different elements of the retaliatory nuclear firing chain based on this generic definition here. So running left to right, initially a nuclear threat is detected, then the decision to respond is made, then the receipt of the command by the weapon platform, then targeting, then the actual launch and engagement, and finally an assessment. Fueled by technological advances, we are currently in an AI summer, a period of increased interest and funding in AI research. And AI is beginning to shape our society, and its power is being harnessed to both supplement human performance and replace it. And we're seeing countless headlines of the ways AI is benefiting humanity, but also stark warnings of the dangers. The benefits of computation and autonomy have been incorporated into nuclear weapon systems since their inception. And here's a brief look at some examples of AI precursors. Now, both of these are Soviet systems, but the US had some very similar counterparts. Firstly, the OCO system, a satellite-based early warning system which used image recognition to detect missile launch source from infrared satellite imagery. And this early warning technology decreased the time from launch to identify threats, affording more time for response decision making. However, the technology was not entirely reliable and was prone to reporting false positives. And in fact, a major malfunction occurred in 1983, nearly causing a catastrophe. The system mistakenly identified sunlight on high altitude clouds as an incoming US missile attack. Fortunately, the officer on duty believed the readings to be erroneous and decided not to follow orders and report them to his superiors, the protocol of whom would have been to retaliate in kind. Another system of interest is the dead hand system, a system to ensure nuclear retaliatory capability. At its most capable, the system was able to operate in a semi-automated mode that did not require a command authority to launch. In this case, the system would detect nuclear impacts in the USSR, and in the event that the Soviet command and control infrastructure was destroyed, would pass the ultimate authority to a small team of duty officers, who could then invoke the perimeter system to communicate and coordinate launch orders to the remaining nuclear arsenal. Benefits of this system include an increased robustness of second strike, allowing more decision time to firing authority, and reducing the likelihood of rash decisions. To rationalize the later analysis of the firing chain, current example applications of AI in other industries were researched to extrapolate from. And 4 of the key applications under consideration are pattern recognition, image recognition, data fusion, and autonomy. And AI makes each of these applications more feasible and enhanced, although it's granted there are some considerable overlaps between them. So possibly the key application is pattern recognition, and some examples of this include social media analysis and medical diagnosis. And image recognition is a form of pattern recognition applied to images. There are lots of common examples in everyday life, such as facial recognition on phones and identification of objects and animals in pictures. Data fusion is a process of getting data from multiple sources in order to build more sophisticated, reliable, and accurate information about subjects of interest. And this is a technique that has key uses in detection, such as radar and sonar, and can be greatly improved with AI augmentation. And finally, autonomy is really a combination of the other 3 and has some obvious applications in including robotics and self-driving cars. So these examples have been used to analyze how each element of the nuclear firing chain could be augmented with AI, how this enhances the capability, and if this alters the level of human involvement. So starting with detection, AI can be augmented into sensor data interrogation, such as early warning radar and satellite imagery. And intelligent data fusion, pattern and image recognition have the potential to detect launches earlier, increasing the response decision time and bolstering the deterrence argument. Furthermore, with the use of more recent techniques such as deep learning, there is potential to produce predictions far more accurate than any preceding system, resulting in less emphasis on the need for human verification. There are a number of ways in which AI can be augmented to the firing authority element. Here, AI could perform analysis of complex, fast-changing big data sets, providing deeper analysis than any human or hard program system could. This could involve the detection of more subtle patterns, such as the prevailing social media sentiment of the country of interest, to things like analysis of troop movements and posturing, something that is in fact being actively researched. An example of this type of data analysis stems from the combined military exercise Able Archer 83, in which NATO military exercises led the USSR to think a preemptive nuclear strike was imminent. And these firing authority AI augmentations have the potential to completely remove the human from the loop, or at least limit it to the final decision. There's more limited scope for AI to be augmented at the platform authority stage, with the likely implementation being an increase in autonomy. An automatic system would have the potential to process a firing command faster than a human system could, and could carry out a more robust authorization and verification process. This possibility of removing the human from the system could allow for significant changes to the design of the delivery platform, although this is outside the scope of this work. Any AI augmentation of the targeting phase is likely to have little impact to the level of human involvement, as in most cases this is mostly computational already. Here, AI has a potential to use a multitude of real-time data sources to optimize the route and launch conditions, such as launch time and location to avoid interceptors, and maximize the launch success and coordination. Perhaps the most interesting augmentations of AI could come at the engage phase. AI could be used to update the route in real time based on weather conditions or enemy defenses. And there's lots of potential for AI to aid in countermeasure performance, such as actively jamming enemy sensors, countermeasures that are more situationally aware and adapt to threats, and in a coordinated attack, could even learn from the failures of preceding attacks. Another benefit of the increased situational awareness could be the capability to detect changing conditions, such as those that would lead to the need for an aborted launch. And finally, the assessment phase is essentially a repeat of the detection phase, with AI benefiting speed and accuracy. So now that we have seen the ways in which AI could augment the firing chain and shift the focus away from humans, we need to examine how to make it safe. Assuring the safety of AI systems is challenging because they are incredibly complex, layered, and unpredictable, and are highly dependent on the data they have been trained on. There's a lack of transparency in their decision-making processes, so it's difficult for humans to understand the logical reasoning behind some of their inferences. Given these points, it's difficult to have assurance in the system without any oversight. And there have been a number of accidents involving automatic and AI systems, such as the Uber self-driving car collision and the Yokohama train crash. With traditional safety management, safety assessment can be carried out prior to development and remains largely valid throughout life. With AI, however, there are added difficulties and gaps. So in addition to gaps between the real world and the world as we imagine it, there are also inherited gaps between the world as we imagine it and how an AI system might imagine it. In real world applications, there are so many scenarios and permutations of events that AI systems require to be continued and proactive assessment in operation. AI systems perceive the world in completely different ways to humans, and it's sometimes very confusing to see how they make their inferences. This cat or guac example illustrates this. In this case, Google's Inception v3 image classifier had some difficulties identifying a cat from this picture on the left. When this image was run through the neural network, you can see that it was almost certain that it was guacamole. Something that you can see from the picture on the right-hand side is quite different to a cat. However, when the image was only slightly tilted, it was reasonably certain that it was in fact a tabby cat. So compared to human inference, it's hard to see how this subtle difference could completely change the prediction of the network. And this cat image was in fact deliberately generated to fool the network and serves as an illustration that an AI system can be deceived by the data it's fed. So how can a system be made safe? Amadei et al. Proposed 5 requirements. So firstly, avoiding negative side effects, avoiding reward hacking. For example, when trained to play Tetris, an AI paused the game indefinitely to avoid losing. There's also a need for scalable oversight, so human interaction to both monitor and confirm decisions made. Safe exploration, so avoiding hazards from previously unconsidered scenarios. And finally, robustness to distributional shift, adaptation to changing environments. And Burton et al. Have some practical suggestions of how to assure AI safety. Firstly, as mentioned, continued assurance is important. Current regulations don't cover AI, but the use of standard industry codes of practice is a good starting point. And a dynamic form of regulation is needed. From the previous slides, it's been seen that there are some significant opportunities for AI to be augmented into nuclear weapon systems that you can see listed here. AI has the potential to vastly supplement the information available to decision makers and to increase engagement, performance, and success. However, a lot of these opportunities come with some really serious risks. With AI systems, there's always a question as to the reliability of the system. And due to its complexity, it's often hard for humans to understand how they make their inferences. It's hard to forget how close the world came to a catastrophe with the false positives during the Cold War, which begs the question, is it ever safe to take the human out of the loop? An interesting way to address this question is to ask how much human is actually in the loop. Modern warfare is spread out and complex, and commanders and strategists don't see it with their own eyes, as data is relayed to them that is manipulated and fused. If these processing stages are augmented with AI, then can the human viewing the information really provide an independent check? Maybe independent checks are needed at all stages, not just at the end. So in summary, there are numerous benefits to the incorporation of artificial intelligence into nuclear weapon systems. Given the stakes, the associated risks cannot be ignored. Safety should be paramount in any system design, and human oversight should not be undervalued or superfluous. And I leave you with the words of Elisa Yudkowsky, a prominent AI researcher, who said, "By far the greatest danger of artificial intelligence is that people conclude too early that they understand it."
Thank you so much for that. It was a really interesting overview, I think, of all of those different potential applications of AI. Two things I picked up. I think the first is that importance of definitions. I think you see a lot of the time AI, machine learning, autonomy, they're often used interchangeably, and there isn't always that full understanding of what we mean by each term. So I think, you highlighted there the importance of that. And I think also the question on the role of the human in decision making, what this really means in practice, a lot of those legal questions, and particularly as we're looking at these new technologies and how we might actually implement them in reality. Just quickly, before we move on to the next speaker, just a reminder to all of you watching, you can start using the Q&A function now. You can start asking your questions. The earlier you get them in, the more likely they will be upvoted by everyone else, and the more likely that I will choose that one to be asked. So if you have a particular question that you're really keen on getting asked, get it in early, get everyone to upvote, and then we can make sure that we get to discuss that issue. And on that, then, if I could ask Charlotte to start.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Charlotte Levy, and I'm a graduate safety engineer working with Babcock International, and I'm based in Devonport. I'm going to speak to you today about the global artificial intelligence race and strategic balance, in which I mention how a combination of key innovations may have the greatest impact. So which AI race are we running? To answer that, first, I'll give a very brief overview of the standards of the race, which is our current AI capabilities. Then I'll speak about the competitors of this AI race, which then leads into speaking about the tactics of the race, being in which areas I believe that AI will have a significant impact. And finally, at the finish line, I'll end with some conclusions and recommendations. Race standards. So where is AI capability currently? So first wave capability, as depicted in this image, involves a computer being able to follow a logical reasoning process based on the information that we put into it, such as using online tax forms, for example. Second wave technology, as you can see in the center image here, is based on machine learning techniques and includes things like natural language processes and facial recognition. And right now, we're at the beginning of the third wave of AI, in which is included the capability of contextual sophistication. As an example here, we have autonomous ships. So we're also still in the realm known as weak or narrow artificial intelligence, in which AI is optimized for specific narrow tasks. Strong AI, or artificial general intelligence, is the goal, and that's where a machine will have human-like cognitive capability. So many nations are racing to be at the forefront of artificial intelligence capability. South Korea, China, and Russia, for example, have all announced their AI strategy up until 2030. Despite these initiatives by various countries, the US remains ahead in a majority of AI capability metrics, with the UK running in third behind China, closely followed by Canada, Germany, and France, according to one source, and other sources use different metrics to generate their rankings. So for example, this map shows the quantity of academic and corporate collaborations in different countries around the world, and you can see that these are largely prevalent in the US, China, Japan, France, Germany, and the UK. However, different countries are using artificial intelligence very differently. So Japan, for instance, is applying the technology to cope with its aging population. China have received a lot of attention for their use of AI in facial recognition, and AI applied to the military is large on the agenda of the US, China, Russia, and Israel. Europe in general is doing a lot of work on the economic and societal consequences of the growing use of AI in various areas of life. However, they generally pay too little attention to the military aspects of AI. France, however, has recently revealed their own AI military defense strategy, which highlights state interest in military AI capabilities. And in 2019, the UK created an AI lab and is believed to be the European country that invests the most in military research and development, even though no figures on the current level of funding are available. So during the EU, NATO and Artificial Intelligence Conference in November 2019 held in Brussels, which was co-organised by the EU Institute for Security Studies and the Finnish presidency of the Council of the EU, it was acknowledged that both the EU and NATO were just beginning to grapple with the issue of AI in defence, whereas Russia and China had already started thinking strategically about this. So with regards to the use of AI in defence in the military, the European Defence Agency has analysed what it considers to be the current 10 key most disruptive defence innovations, and these can be seen in the table displayed here. These are all very broad categories, and the applications within are vast. And so rather than speaking about any one particular area, I'm going to speak about how a combination of the development of some of these disruptive technologies may unfold and impact each other over the next 20 years. So these innovations span cognitive computing, autonomous systems, robotics, big data, data analytics, and communications. And the connecting technology between these selective innovations is artificial intelligence. And once combined, these innovations can have novel and unknown consequences on Euro-Atlantic security and UK deterrence posture. So according to Emerge, the AI research and advisory company, some form of automatic car will likely be on the road within the next 10 years, and the implications of how this type of technology will affect the battlefield has already been discussed. The command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or C4ISR, has been identified as a potential area of impact over the next 20 years, in which AI-enabled autonomous systems will be employed by warfighting units. For example, here is a photo of an unmanned vehicle during exercise Autonomous Warrior in 2018. These military systems can carry lethal weapons as their payload, but as far as the software is concerned, they're not very different from the autonomous systems that we could find in a range of civilian domains. And this has already led to high-profile ethical debates involving not only self-driving cars, but lethal autonomous weapon systems, or LAWs. Several observers anticipate that sophisticated AI-augmented autonomous weapon systems will soon be deployed for a range of ISR and strike missions, because the AI in these systems can reduce the need for human contribution, that human input and interference during operation. For example, the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory is working on an intelligent ship project in which the requirements to develop applications essential to the future force will be gathered. Another example of autonomous technologies is in the picture displayed here, which is of the Mayflower autonomous ship, and will begin its journey to Plymouth in the US on the 6th of September, commemorating the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrim Fathers' voyage to the New World. The Plymouth-based companies and Plymouth University, all here in the UK, have been refining design since 2014 to ensure it can survive whatever conditions the Atlantic Ocean has to offer. So Dr. James Johnson, who presented last year, during an interview I conducted with him, said that in the longer term, as the technology matures, one would expect more use of AI in decision-making, prediction, and machine-to-machine combat scenarios, for example, swarms of drones. A major concern is whether and how AI and autonomy can be introduced to the nuclear enterprise, which could harbinger a host of hidden and unexpected outcomes for strategic stability and nuclear security. This is further elaborated upon in his bodies of work. It's believed that the capacity for at least some aspects of decision-making could be achieved by 2040. The proliferation of these conventional military technologies, such as hypersonic weapons and autonomous weapons systems, could undermine traditional modes of escalation management and, as a consequence, nuclear stability, because continued advances in this technology could render the boundaries between human control and autonomous guidance indistinct. Russia doesn't seem to be wasting any time in applying this sort of technology to their military capability. This is a picture of their nuclear-powered Poseidon underwater drone that's scheduled to be test launched soon. The drone is shaped like a giant torpedo, powered by a small nuclear reactor, and is built to carry a nuclear warhead with a supposed range of 10,000 kilometers and can autonomously cross the North Atlantic. So, although driverless vehicles still require a lot more training data and are now being deployed in very limited circumstances, I also believe that the same can be said for most autonomous systems. Unfortunately, smart technologies that rely on bidirectional wireless links to communicate with devices and services in the wider world give a larger attack surface that cyber threats target. And this is because of the way these technologies are interlinked in order to make effective use of them. So this figure here shows how each new layer in the model is a consequence of the growth of the layer beneath it, to which more value is added. So AI-related technologies can help turn big data into something useful, such as autonomous vehicles, for example. You can also see that big data is gathered from communications, such as the internet, and that all started with the advent of computers. The advances in analyzing big data allow us to do many things. For example, to decode human DNA in minutes, to accurately predict human behavior, foil terrorist attacks, and to find cures for diseases. China seems poised to become the global leader in 5G technology. However, Huawei's products and services have been assessed as highly insecure, yet remain attractive to certain countries that fear falling behind in 5G and may not have the technological capabilities themselves. So the US, citing Huawei equipment's high-risk nature to critical infrastructures, responded with threats of restricting intelligence cooperation. Personal profiling and predictive behavioral analysis done by big data applications pose challenges to society when they violate individuals' fundamental rights to privacy and data protection. They also threaten basic ethical principles needed in a democratic society, such as fairness. On the 28th of January, the UK announced that Huawei will be allowed to build part of the country's 5G core network. However, the UK's Huawei Cybersecurity Evaluation Centre Oversight Board reported in 2018 that the source code can cause systems to behave differently in various environments, and that security-critical third-party software used in a variety of products was not subject to sufficient control. Huawei replied that it may need 3 to 5 years to mitigate these two flaws. However, by then, most decisions about 5G contracts would have been made, and the construction of 5G networks will already be underway. Therefore, the implications of AI for EU and UK security and defence are largely unknown at this stage. So because the big data scenario is still in its infancy, and we're currently not experiencing all of the possible effects at the social, economic and environmental level, the European Data Protection Supervisor has stated during an interview that the debate is centred around anticipating the technological development. However, if many critical components of a nation's 5G internet infrastructure, hardware and software are of Chinese origin, it gives China easier access to snoop or disrupt that country's online communications. Neither China nor the US have yet gained a dominant influence, but they and Russia are alert to AI's power to change modern warfare. They grasp the geopolitics of AI and may pursue techno-nationalist agendas in recognition of this. So to conclude, Europe is behind the US, China and Russia regarding direct military AI applications, despite Russia being low in most AI capability metrics, and the UK with other European countries being ranked relatively higher. With the development of AI capability over the next 20 years, I predict that a combination of the key disruptive technologies will pose large unknown risks to Euro-Atlantic security and UK deterrence posture. Although a high level of automation in defensive capabilities, such as air and missile defense, is not novel or unexpected, the offensive employment of such capabilities does raise new risks and concerns, and the capacity for at least some aspects of decision-making could be achieved by 2040. However, there are two major limitations in the current AI technology. The first is that huge amounts of data are needed to train the system, and this data often needs to be labeled. And the second is that context is still very poorly understood by the systems, which is why human machine teams and semi-automated systems are the only way to harness the benefits of AI. And so for most AI-related technologies, the next 5 years will likely see a lot of piloting to find out what works in the real world while building those crucial data sets. And that's also what we'd expect to see if one were building these powerful new technologies into a surveillance state, and for instance, is what we see now in China. The development of artificial general intelligence, or strong AI, which is the human-like behavior exhibited by machines, remains a significant technical challenge that's considered unlikely to be reached by some sources within the next 20 years, and concerns that AI is approaching a winter of slow growth have been raised. Different militaries may lead or possess particular proficiency in different applications, and the implications of AI for EU security and defence are largely unknown. It's for these reasons that I believe more attention is needed on translating basic research into applied research and innovation in the civil and defence sectors. Additionally, the European Commission has stated that it's important for the EU to establish technological sovereignty in areas of key strategic importance, such as defence, space, mobile networks like 5G and 6G, and quantum computing. So in the meantime, European actors should help countries to resist US and Chinese pressure to prevent the further emergence of technospheres by establishing a body to vet technologies of critical importance and impose a cap on the market share of those suppliers likely to dominate. And this is so that the UK can endeavour to understand how the risks that come with foreign equipment can be mitigated. I conducted an interview with Dr. Nicholas Wright, editor of Artificial Intelligence, China, Russia and the Global Order, and he said, with regards to how AI will develop over the next 20 years, is that it depends on whether the problem of context is cracked. If not, then AI will have its impact in bounded decisions like surveillance, logistics, factories, trains, and things that can go in relatively limited and more constrained situations. Although it's uncertain exactly how AI will develop, it is clear that it will have a great impact on security and deterrence. And that ends my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Really interesting presentation. Again, a couple of things that I picked up on there. I think the first is that concept of a race. We're often hearing about arms races and space races, and the need to understand and define what we mean by that. Races generally have finishing lines. How do we tell who wins? Are they ongoing? So I think it's interesting always to think about how we're defining these competitions in technology development, and also that really important point you made about context and understanding that how we perceive these technologies and their uses might not be the same way that our adversaries are, and that we need to be looking at trying to understand how their perceptions are and what that actually means for their strategies and how we might balance that out. We're going to move on now from AI to look at cyber and space, and if I could ask Marina to start.
All right, my name is Marina Favaro and I am a nuclear policy analyst at BASIC, and before joining the BASIC team, I worked at RAND on space and cybersecurity. So this presentation is an attempt to combine old research interests with new ones. The objectives that I set out at the beginning of this study are threefold. So first, to provide an overview of 15 to 30 technologies in the space and cyber domains. Second, to assess the possible future impacts of these developments upon strategic stability across a 10-year horizon. And third, to propose policy responses. In order to accomplish these objectives, I use the STREAM method, which was developed by Stephen Popper and his RAND colleagues, and is a method that was designed to assess current and potential technologies according to a range of impact and implementation criteria. Now, this is a foresight method, meaning that it can help us to better account for the uncertainties inherent in new technologies. The framing stage is used to identify the function that the technologies will affect. In this case, that is strategic stability. Now, I acknowledge that strategic stability is a very complex concept, so rather than narrow it down to just one definition, I instead focused on defining some metrics that may be applied across different definitions for strategic stability. So these metrics are somewhat definition agnostic, but could be brought together in different ways to reflect different definitions for strategic stability. And the following were used as metrics of strategic stability. So first, the impact of the technology upon the capability of offensive and defensive forces, upon reliable functioning of C4I, and upon acceleration of crisis instability. But I also looked at the ability to counter the technology and the ability to attribute the use of the technology to a specific actor, as well as whether the technology is likely to be developed in the private sector. The second stage is the identify stage, which determines which technologies might impact the function that we set out in the framing stage. So 21 technologies were selected for their potential to tilt the balance of terror one way or the other, and they have the potential to replicate, offset, or mitigate the effects of nuclear weapons, and therefore have the potential to upset some aspects of strategic stability. The third stage, the characterized stage, defines scoring criteria in order to determine how each technology could impact strategic stability and what barriers to implementation exist. So these criteria fall into three broad categories: technological maturity, impact, and implementation. And as we'll see, the 21 technologies will be assessed against these criteria. The compare stage asks a group of experts to evaluate these technologies quantitatively and qualitatively. So for the quantitative analysis, experts were sent a bespoke questionnaire that looked like this, keeping in mind that there are actually 21 technologies and not just the 4 that you see here. You can see that technologies are assessed by a range of technological maturity, impact, and implementation criteria. And they return something that looks like this. Finally, the decide stage analyzes the results and determines what action should be taken with respect to those technologies. So in order to analyze the quantitative findings and prioritize the technologies, I use this framework with 5 aspects. And I'm aware that this is an oversimplification of strategic stability, but this model relies on some simplification of a very complex security environment. So first, I looked at the technological maturity. The rationale for this is that we're looking for technologies that will mature within the next 10 years. For this to be the case, they need to be of a reasonable maturity now. Now, most technologies are considered low to moderate maturity by the experts for the UK and its allies. But a few technologies, namely reusable launch systems, satellite jamming systems, and UAVs, have already reached technological maturity, meaning that they have the potential to cause an imminent threat to strategic stability. Next, we look at the rate of development. The rationale for this is that if technologies develop at different rates between adversaries, then this could lead to asymmetries in capability, which may in turn compromise strategic stability over a 10-year timeframe. This graph shows how barriers to implementation, both ethical and practical, differ for the UK and its allies versus for the UK's adversaries. So in the bottom left corner, both have similar barriers, whereas in the top right corner, the barriers differ. Specifically, adversaries have lower barriers to implementation. And interestingly, whereas there's variation in ethical barriers across the x-axis, we can see that the practical barriers are roughly the same for both parties, shown on the y-axis. The highlighted technologies here can be understood as being a higher or a more imminent risk because the ethical barriers to development and/or deployment are less for adversaries than they are for the UK and its allies, and practical barriers are about the same. Next, looking at capability increase. The rationale for including this is that technologies that significantly increase offensive or defensive capabilities or reduce or enhance the reliable functioning of C4I pose a threat to strategic stability, and this is especially the case with technologies that are difficult to counter. So this graph illustrates the landscape of capability increase across all technologies, accounting for the increase in offensive capability in blue, the increase in defensive capability in green, and the increase in ability to reduce or enhance the reliable functioning of C4I in yellow. This shows the technologies with the greatest overall capability increase, which are AI-trained offensive cyber attacks, direct ascent ASAT weapons, satellite jamming systems, quantum cryptography, and quantum computing. So technologies that significantly impact all 3 of these capabilities are well positioned to impact strategic stability. Next, we look at the ease of countering these technologies. So the rationale for including this is that technologies that are more difficult to counter are potentially destabilizing because a central tenet of strategic stability is that a potential attacker could be dissuaded if that attacker perceives a countermeasure to their measure. This slide surveys the ease or difficulty of countering each technology, whereas this slide highlights the technologies that have the most potential to upset strategic stability because they're the most difficult to counter. These are AI-trained offensive cyber attacks, quantum cryptography and computing, space quantum communications, cyber attacks on biotechnology, and hypersonic missiles. Finally, we look at crisis instability. The thinking behind this is that technologies with the potential to trigger an escalatory response might result in a nuclear first strike, which is clearly antithetical to strategic stability. This graph shows the extent to which each technology, if deployed, would be likely to accelerate crisis instability. Whereas this slide shows that the top 5 technologies that would be likely to escalate an ongoing crisis are hypersonic missiles, AI-trained defensive cyber attacks, rendezvous and proximity missions, satellite jamming systems, and DEWs. Next, we can combine some of these metrics in order to get a more nuanced view of the impact of these technologies upon strategic stability. So beginning with combining technological maturity and rate of development, when we combine the current technological maturity with barriers to implementation, we can get a better idea of where technologies are right now and how quickly they might reach maturity if they're not already at a high level of maturity. So this graph shows us that differing ethical barriers on the x-axis, differing practical barriers on the y-axis, and the size and color of the bubbles corresponds to the technological maturity of each capability. The technologies highlighted in red are both at a moderate maturity level, with lower ethical barriers for the UK's adversaries relative to the UK and its allies, and have about the same practical barriers for both parties. These include rendezvous and proximity missions, AI-trained offensive cyber attacks, AI for ISR, and direct ascent ASAT weapons. Cyber attacks on biotechnology, which you can see here, is technologically immature, but has the greatest disparity in ethical barriers between the UK and its allies versus its adversaries, meaning that the development could happen quite quickly. On the other hand, UAVs, seen here, are very mature technologically, but the lower ethical barriers for the UK's adversaries might mean that they are less constrained in their deployment of this technology. Next, combining the remaining 3 factors, capability increase, ease of countering, and crisis instability, we can see that this graph shows the increase in capability on the x-axis, the difficulty in countering that technology on the y-axis, and the size and color of each bubble corresponds to that technology's ability to accelerate crisis instability. So together, these metrics give us a more detailed picture of the potential impacts of these technologies upon strategic stability. On this slide, the technologies that are highlighted in red, e.g. hypersonics and AI-trained offensive cyber attacks, will significantly increase capabilities, are difficult to counter, and are highly likely to accelerate crisis instability. The technologies highlighted in amber will have a similar impact on capabilities and are similarly difficult to counter, but they are slightly less likely to accelerate crisis instability. So all the highlighted technologies on this slide will have a significant impact on strategic stability, just for different reasons. And finally, pulling together all the quantitative results. I used a simple addition method, which was kind of the easiest way I could see to combine all 5 factors. A more advanced model might capture all these results in a more nuanced way and or include some of the factors that I left out here. For example, the likelihood of the technology being produced in the private sector and the ability to attribute the use of this technology to a specific actor, etc. But this was meant to be a foundational study, and I have many ideas on how to develop this further. But what this gives us are the top 5 technologies that are most likely to have the largest impact on strategic stability. So these include AI-trained offensive cyber attacks, hypersonic missiles, rendezvous and proximity operations, direct ascent anti-satellite weapons, and satellite jamming systems. In addition to the quantitative findings that I just showed you, there were a huge amount of qualitative remarks that came from the comments within the scoring exercise, as well as in an exercise debrief with some of the participants. And these are just a select few findings that came from that. So first, who is considered an ally or adversary of the UK can differ depending on the technology. For example, India has successfully demonstrated anti-satellite capabilities, but does this make them an adversary of the UK? And does this apply uniformly to all technology areas? These are questions that we weren't able to answer. Second, what we think of as ethically right or wrong is not universal. So experts talked about some of the things that we think of as right, or at least acceptable in the UK, being targeted killing via drones, the Met Police's use of facial recognition, algorithmic bias, etc. And these are obviously not universal rights. So nor are the wrongs. Ethical issues for the UK and its allies primarily arise when a human is no longer in the loop or when the technology infringes upon IHL. We talked about how there's a sense of an arms race in quantum capabilities, with one expert noting that the prestige that would come from this breakthrough is analogous to the race for nuclear weapons in past decades. We talked about how the involvement from the private sector will shift the future of diplomacy and arms control, including who gets to the table, how AI R&D is driven by the private sector in the UK primarily, which would create issues when it comes to optimizing this technology for defense applications. And finally, even experts are susceptible to hype in their assessments, meaning that experts had the opportunity to not score technology if they thought they were not familiar with it. However, hypersonics were scored across the board, and this may be because hypersonics are talked about so much that experts feel more literate in this technology, meaning that they might score it according to the hype and not according to what a cohort of experts in missile technologies might score it as, i.e. thinking that it's maybe not that different from ICBMs. So to wrap up, the so what of my presentation is that I think that the stream method was uniquely well suited to this research project because assessing the possible future impacts of technological developments upon strategic stability is a fraught and difficult task, as many of us know. The benefits to this approach include that it can be difficult to cut through hype and misinformation. So using a rigorous framework like the stream method to conduct scoring is very helpful in this respect. Comparing technologies, especially across two domains, can feel like comparing apples and oranges. And futures and foresight methods are as much about the process as they are about the outcome. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A if anyone's interested. So the result is that we, the nuclear policy community, are better positioned to prioritize and allocate resources to these technologies with a ranking like I've done. And finally, I just want to say thank you to everyone that participated in this. This was a truly collaborative effort, and I'm simply a conduit for the brilliance of my friends and colleagues who contributed to the study in so many ways as interviewees, expert scorers, stream debrief participants, and quality assurance. Thank you.
Really interesting. You brought up again that question of definitions, which we see a bit of a recurring theme. And I think that means, that's something we all need to be thinking about when we're having discussions about these technologies, is how we're defining things. That's a really interesting model, and I think it's useful to see how it can help bound, the discussions that we're having, remove some of that uncertainty, and really highlight those specific areas that we should be looking at, those areas of most importance. Really, really interesting. So last but not least, we're going to move on to looking at open source intelligence. So Jaewoo, if I could ask you to start, please.
My name is Jaewoo Shin, and I'm an analyst at the Open Nuclear Network in Vienna, Austria, where I conduct open source research related to nuclear risk reduction and the Korean Peninsula in specific. I'm still very much learning and thinking about the topic I will be speaking about today. So I appreciate this opportunity and look forward to your questions and comments. I start with the usual disclaimer that none of the views and opinions expressed today necessarily reflect those of my employer. My topic today is about the changing information environment governments are facing as a consequence of emerging technologies. Specifically, I want to explore the two-part question of, one, how the erosion of government agencies' hold over security-related intelligence may affect crisis dynamics, and two, what the role of private entities such as NGOs, think tanks, and the like is in this new information environment. I will first provide some background on the democratization of intelligence capabilities and focus on geospatial capabilities in particular. Then I try to conceptualize the impact of this changing information environment on crisis dynamics, outline some ethical implications and concerns for the analyst community, and illustrate those with the help of one specific example. I conclude with some questions to consider when facing an ethical disclosure dilemma. So the reason why I'm focusing on geospatial capabilities here is because this has really been, as you all know, a transformation for our field of study. Commercial satellite imagery has been available since around the 70s or 80s, but only in recent years have there been really massive developments temporally. So meaning the revisit rate of a particular location has increased, allowing easier detection of changes over time. Spatially, meaning simply coverage, and spectral improvements with sub-meter resolution and sensors that can capture more than what we can absorb with our own eyes. It's an enormous and growing market, which has allowed for lower pricing and improved access for us, especially now with trends pointing towards creating new constellations based on micro and mini satellites, such as the current leading provider Planet has been doing. You may think that military satellites are still much more advanced and that private capabilities are still limited, but consider that, for example, the US is now actively working on integrating commercial data with its own government data. The reason clearly has to do with the benefits of a sheer amount and the increased revisit rate that is possible only with many satellites as opposed to few but more advanced ones. Improvements in satellite imagery is an obvious example for this democratization, but of course it is also just one part only of the analytical portfolio that is now available to non-governmental entities. I should also mention that even though I included the term real-time in the title of my presentation today, we are obviously not quite there yet. However, I would argue that it is the integration of many kinds of data that will prove to really get us close to that point and erode government's near monopoly on this. This is something that the organization I'm working for is very much focused on. But continuing with the example of geospatial imagery, you can think of the political implications as being two-pronged. As I mentioned, there's active civil military cooperation, complex or fusion, however you want to call it. So in effect, what should be democratization rather serves to maintain the gap in capabilities between governments and the public. But then you also have a growing field of civilian geospatial intelligence, particularly in our field of nuclear non-proliferation, verification, and so on, as of course also exemplified by the great work of RUSI's own analysts. But also in non-hard security related issue areas, such as, for example, natural resource conservation, maritime security, and human rights investigations. Stepping back again slightly, how can we think about the traditional information environment governments are facing in a conceptual way? Specifically, what is the role of secrecy and covert activity in international relations? This has been a growing field of interest in academic literature and really quite relevant for this topic, in my opinion. So very generally, you can say that governments have, of course, both incentives and constraints to keep information about themselves and or their adversaries secret or disclose them in ways that advance their interests. This is what, for example, Carnegie and Carson have called the disclosure dilemma. When facing a disclosure decision, governments weigh political and operational costs and benefits, both domestically as well as abroad. To continue thinking in this underlying rationalist way of conceptualizing states' decision-making, those in the audience with an IA background will also be well familiar with Fearon's Rationalist Explanations for War. It's basically about the idea that there's always an ex-ante bargaining range of outcomes that states prefer to the outcome of war. The exceptions and therefore explanations for war that he outlines are a few that I won't get into here, but one important risk he talks about is the risk of war due to private information and incentives to misrepresent. More specifically, it can be that because of private information, there's this disagreement about relative power, miscalculation of the other's willingness to fight, or incentives to misrepresent in a bargaining situation. In this traditional framework, we can then think of the disclosure dilemma as consisting of basically three different positions a government can assume. Disclosure to conduct overt signaling and bargaining, to strengthen credibility, or to name and shame an adversary. Alternatively, a government can assume a more ambiguous position to neither confirm nor deny as part of an operational calculus because it is wary of audience costs or reputational hits, or importantly, not to reveal intelligence capabilities, sources, and methods. Then, of course, we also have the option of just keeping it secret and denying, which can be assumed for similar reasons as for the previous one. But, and this has been suggested by recent literature, also for covert signaling and bargaining. The argument there is that rarely is a secret really a secret for an adversary, and that there's a sort of bargaining language operating in this covert realm as well. So what is then the role of private information disclosures? I would argue that they can expand this limited informational bargaining space I've conceptualized before. Private entities are unconstrained by the political and strategic calculus governments have to make, and they can reduce the private information and incentives to misrepresent that risk conflict. Private disclosures are, of course, also an independent check on government claims and can make the public more well-informed. They can also be utilized for more effective advocacy of a particular policy issue, and this is something I touch on shortly again. It also allows for the kind of research collaboration that is not possible when governments have near monopoly. So for example, crowd mapping or that kind of GIS collaboration is a great example and something that we are actively working on. But returning to the bargaining framework and the impact, possible impact on crisis dynamics, is that expansion of this space between adversaries is also not automatic. Private disclosures can, of course, also hinder government efforts to de-escalate tensions behind closed doors with the intention to do so without one or both parties losing face. The expansion really happens when information is disclosed that is then shareable, something adversaries can freely talk about without the constraint of keeping intelligence capabilities at bay that I mentioned before. So because we as private actors also face a sort of disclosure dilemma, though it is different, of course, compared to the ones governments face, I think we ought to think about ethical implications. This is because analysts now have considerable power and relative autonomy when it comes to exerting influence on public policy. This power can be abused by manipulating facts in harmful ways, and also, as I have suggested, in possibly crisis escalatory ways. A good illustration of how governments are also concerned about this can be seen from a very early report by the US Congress Office of Technology, suggesting that using satellite imagery can complicate government policy by, for example, disseminating information on active military operations. So thinking about accountability and responsibility, I think should be part of the entire research process from the beginning on. Even if we can always ensure that published information and accompanying analysis is entirely factual, accurate, and fair, it can still be misunderstood, misdirected, or repurposed for a political agenda that the analyst may not agree with. So just one example. To be clear, nothing about this particular example, the publication or analysis, I think is deserving of the reception, apologies, deserving of the reception it received. And I encourage you to check out the original publication itself. I just want to bring attention, what I want to bring to attention with this example is that disclosure can have a life that in part may be out of our control, but that we nevertheless should address to make sure that it doesn't stray far from where we would like it to go. So this is an example where the people at CSIS disclosed missile bases, short-range ballistic missile bases, which was then framed by the New York Times as a great deception, contrary to the terms of the Singapore summit that happened in the same year, when that is just not true. And I've just included some headlines where you can see how different or out of control the reception has been. So some ethical disclosure questions that I myself am pondering about in my work. Ultimately, I think, as Marina also mentioned, there's no universal answer to ethical issues. Ultimately, this is, I think, should be an ongoing conversation, but it includes, for example, that just to ensure that an analysis is accurate, fair, and thorough may just not be enough in our field of study. And with that, I would like to conclude, and I leave you with a quote which to me illustrates quite well how big our responsibility is to get things right in our endeavor to inform the public and governments as well. This was true back in 1954 and still is the case today. Thank you very much for your attention.